Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last lecture of the semester. I can't believe the semester is ending. In some ways, it feels like it flew by, and in other ways, it feels like it lasted a year due to this whole quarantine situation that we're in. I'm glad we're ending with Rogers and Maslow because they have a very positive viewpoint on humanity and our personalities and how they develop, as opposed to some of the other theories that we've looked at so far this semester. So, who were Rogers and Maslow? Well, they were two different individuals who worked with different people. Carl Rogers had worked with juvenile delinquents, and Maslow had studied animal behavior. And these two hooked up, and their theory um, was developed in like the late 50s and the 60s, and it's called humanism, right? So with Freud and Carl Jung and Karen Horney, we talked about psychoanalysis. You've talked about behaviorism in other classes with, B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, um, and then the whole 60s revolution came along, and people kind of started to reject the idea of behaviorism, that people are machines and you can just throw a reinforcer at them and control their behavior. People started to rail against the whole idea of blaming everything on your mother and your childhood and all the Freudian stuff. And these two got together and they wanted to look at what motivates our behavior. And they felt that our personality has a great deal to do with that, as the other theorists we've discussed this semester so far also said. And they came up with what you've probably seen in other classes, which is that triangle of the hierarchy of needs. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the very bottom of it are your physiological needs. Above that is your safety needs. Then you have self esteem. Then you have love and belonging. And then you get to the ultimate goal in humanism, which is called self actualization. Okay. Self actualization is basically you've reached your highest potential as a person. And uh, the hard part about that is that's according to your own standards. Okay. And I've seen different psychology books use Oprah Winfrey as someone who is a self-actualized individual, in the fact that she started in poverty. She started with experiencing abuse, both physically and sexually. And somehow she has been able to not only become famous, but to become a philanthropist. She has made a lot of money, but she also donates a lot of it to charity, and she gives back to her community. Could Oprah lose her fortune and make a few mistakes and start to fall back down that triangle? Absolutely. Okay. So, what Maslow's and Rogers were talking about was basically they had looked at the other psychological theories, and Rogers in particular looked at Adler's theory. And Adler used a lot of case studies when he was developing his theory about the birth order. Rogers felt that the case studies were very cold, they were too long, they were mechanical, and he felt that a therapist could learn more about a patient by learning about what they're like in the here and now, as opposed to focusing so much on their past. And that the ultimate goal of therapy was for you to be able to understand the concept of self-actualization and then actually accomplish being self-actualized. Okay. So there's a few terms that you hear when you look at their theory. The first one is called a need for positive regard. What this means is that you're treating your patients, you're treating other people with warmth, sympathy, care, respect, and acceptance. Now, this sounds like, oh, okay, it's easy. No, it's really not. Why? When you are working in this field, you're going to work with people who have maybe not necessarily always done good things. Many times they may have a criminal record, they may have a history of substance abuse, domestic violence, depending upon what population you end up working with. Sometimes you have people who admit that they do hit their kids, that they lose control. And you, as a therapist, need to have positive regard for them and realize that this is a human being sitting in front of me who um, is not just an example of their behavior, but there's a reason for that behavior, that negative behavior. So I'm going to treat you with positive regard, even if you're telling me things that are not things I want to hear. Why? It's not my place as your therapist to judge you. It is my place to help guide you to self actualize. Okay. Excuse me. They also talk about, and this is a very important term, unconditional positive regard. Um, and when they're talking about kids, okay, they're talking about allowing children to experience like positive regard no matter what they do. So even if they do something wrong, it's not that you shouldn't correct them, but you should give them some kind of like positive reinforcement, some kind of feedback as to why their behavior was wrong and how to do it correctly the next time. None of the you should have done this and you should have done that. No, because what happens is it goes in one ear and out the other. All the kid knows is that they're in trouble, and mom and dad or the adult, whoever it is that's in charge of them, doesn't like them, and you don't really get anywhere with them. So the unconditional positive regard with children is very important in their development. Now, are parents going to yell at their kids? Totally, absolutely. But it's about later on going back and explaining to the child like why you yelled at them. I remember being a kid myself, and I was in the supermarket, and I don't know, I was just in a scutchy mood. I was in grammar school and I didn't get what I wanted. I forget what it was. And I was in the middle of the supermarket and I yelled at my mother, I hate you. I hate you. My father picked me up. He carried me out of that store. And I got quite a scolding. But later on in the day, he sat me down and said, do you realize why you got in so much trouble? Do you realize why you got scolded and yelled at and disciplined? You know, how dare you stand in the middle of a supermarket and talk to your mother like that just because you didn't get something that you wanted? You're not a bad kid, but that behavior is not acceptable. I remember that lesson a lot better than if I had gotten a beating or just been screamed at and not had like that follow up conversation. And that is something that we did when I worked at Four Winds. And when you work in a psych facility, they use different terms for it. But we basically called it like a debriefing where we would sit down with a patient who had an episode, whatever it might be, where they were acting out, and we had to give them a timeout, or we had to restrain them, or give them medication. Part of doing that, part of our training was to show them the unconditional positive regard. And before they would return back to the unit, before they would return back to activities, they would have an understanding of why the staff had intervened and given them a consequence for whatever negative behavior they had. The idea being that you can learn from your mistakes. And I think that there's a lot to that. It makes a lot of sense. Okay. The other thing that, another term that you guys should know is non directive therapy. And what that is Rogers and Maslow felt that we really do have the ability to solve our own problems. Therapy is a way to process those problems, to have someone listen to you unconditionally, to give you feedback. But at the end of the day, you know, the average person should be able to say, oh, you know what? Now that I've talked about it for a while, I can connect the dots and see why I'm such a nervous adult. X, Y, and Z went on when I was a kid. Or someone can say to themselves, wow, I really do need to stop using drugs and alcohol. It is definitely affecting my relationships, my work performance, etc. So that term humanism really does apply in the fact that the therapist is saying to the client, listen, I'm going to help you, but at the end of the day, you have to solve your own problems and you are completely capable of it. And a lot of people don't realize that they are capable of controlling their thoughts, that they're able to start to figure out when their behaviors are going to go in a negative direction and stop those behaviors. And a humanist therapist really tries to emphasize this non-directive therapy. It's also called client-centered therapy, meaning that, it really is not about anything else than the person's need to self-actualize. So a therapist who takes this approach is working on your self-esteem, working on trying to make you realize what your potential is. And when you struggle with depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses, sometimes you lose sight of the fact that you have other components of your personality besides your mental illness. Okay. It's just that your mental illness gets in the way of you being able to self actualize and to reach your greatest potential. Okay. Humanistic psychology is also called third force psychology. And that is because it was a response, as I said before, to psychoanalysis and behaviorism. What I really like about this theory, and I think it's something that's a really good way to end this tumultuous semester on, is that it emphasizes creativity. It emphasizes the study of social and personally significant problems. It's an alternative to psychoanalysis and behaviorism. And that's where that hierarchy of needs comes into play, which is in your textbook. And I believe it might be in one of the handouts that's on eClass at the top of the page. And then we talk about the Jonah complex, which a few of you mentioned in your forums. Okay. What is the Jonah complex? The Jonah complex is basically, it's related to the fear of self-knowledge. It's one of the reasons that people avoid therapy, where it's like, I don't know if I want to dig at that iceberg. Maybe I should just leave what went on in the past in the past. I don't know. And sometimes what you do is you kind of stunt yourself by not exploring who you are and why you do what you do. The Jonah complex is basically like you're almost afraid, you are afraid of your own potential. And you're kind of ambivalent back and forth about, how you feel about other people and in regards to what your accomplishments are. So, the thing with the Jonah complex is that it's really easy for us to self-sabotage ourselves because we don't believe in ourselves. And I think that that's something that really is applicable to most people. And you see it in therapy, whether you're using a humanistic approach or another approach where, it's scary to look at your subconscious, and it's scary to look at your faults, and it's scary to look at, why you do what you do. But at the same point, once you figure that out, you can stop those negative behaviors or continue the positive ones. And that's basically what their goal is when working with people. Excuse me. Maslow attempted to correct the fact that psych had concentrated so much on unhealthy humans, right? Like, what have we talked about all semester? Neuroticism, anxiety, panic, personality disorders. And what he wanted to do was, instead of studying unhealthy people, like his predecessors had done, he wanted to study healthy people, people who were accomplished, people who felt good about themselves. And the reason for that was, well, what makes you feel good about yourself? Why do you have, a healthy self-esteem and self-confidence? Where do you get those things from? And then to be able to help people who have a negative self-concept apply those principles um, to making themselves feel better and be able to reach that self-actualization. And this area of psychology is also called positive psychology. Um, you look at the other theorists, and they kind of look at humanity through the glass as being like half empty, as opposed to like half full. The humanists look at it as being half full. They explore the higher aspects of humans. They look at our spirituality. They look at you know, just the sum of our childhood and our experiences. They do not rely on science as much as the behaviorists do, but they do seem to be very successful with people who, need to build up their self-esteem, need to feel better about themselves in order to be successful. And right now we're going through a very unique period in our history, and I'm glad that we're ending the semester on this positive note, in the fact that, you know, maybe having this time to ourselves will help us to learn a little bit more about like how we can self-actualize, what our positive attributes are. And when you spend some time alone with yourself, which we've all been doing, you have some time to think about that. So my advice to you is try to focus on the positive. Like, we all have our stuff. We all engage in negative behaviors. We've all said and done things that we don't necessarily feel too good about. But at the end of the day, what Rogers and Maslow are saying is, overall, humans are inherently good. Just sometimes we screw up and we do things wrong, and there's a reason for it. And that the majority of the human population has a superego, and we try to be the best that we can. So I hope this review is helpful. The other reviews are also posted on eClass. My suggestion to you is all those YouTube clips that I posted at the beginning of the semester. If you have not been watching them, you might want to watch them to review for your final, in addition to using the class notes on eClass, these lectures, and your textbook. I'll be posting a message to you guys over the next few days about the end of the semester. I hope you're hanging in there, and I miss you lots. Okay? Good luck, and keep in touch.